Good to be here together today. We are continuing our series and going through the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Bible, the books of Moses, the books of the law. There's many titles for that section of Scripture. I didn't even just now give a comprehensive list, but we have progressed through the first 4 and now come to Deuteronomy. And so to begin, I want to stir you up by way of reminder of what we've talked about so far in each of them, just very briefly. Hopefully you remember at least these themes from each of the books that we've talked about so far. Long ago when we started this with Genesis, we talked about the beginning of all things, of course, the generation of all things, but also an emphasis in relationships and regeneration. In Genesis, we see that focus. In Exodus, we see the deliverance of God's people out of slavery in Egypt, brought to Mount Sinai, where they begin to learn what it is to worship the God that delivered them. In Leviticus, the focus is on holiness and builds up to chapter 16 with the Day of Atonement, the message of atonement being a heavy theme in Leviticus and an important aspect of daily life and certainly yearly life for God's people. And in Numbers, we see it being called in Hebrews, or by the Hebrews, the Book of Wanderings. And we see the theme there amidst the wandering of the discipline of the Lord for His people. And so when we look at these themes, it gives us a good reminder of what in general is being discussed and what the big picture point is of telling us today about what happened thousands of years ago. To people that we can't picture or imagine, to people that we can't know personally in this life, but to understand what happened and how God interacted with the people that went on before us and who lived lives that built towards Christ, who is our all in all today. When we look at Deuteronomy, and I'll show you the slide with our theme for our keyword for Deuteronomy here in a moment, but when we look at Deuteronomy, none of these points that we see here in the first 4 books of the Bible are forgotten. When we come into Deuteronomy, we see it in many ways as Moses giving the history of the people in various of the speeches in Deuteronomy to varying degrees or extents. Does he give their history, but he's reminding them of who they are. And so when we look at Deuteronomy, it is the culmination of everything that's come before it. It is not only sequential in order or in chronology of what's happening, but it's sequential in thought. Deuteronomy and what happens in Deuteronomy, what is said in Deuteronomy, is the natural consequence of understanding all of these things. That the God who established relationships with mankind, though He is holy and eternal and we are sinful and temporary, He forged relationships with us, and when we broke them, He offers regeneration. He promises regeneration. He restores what we have broken. He moves first to reconcile with His people, and even before they left the garden, there was the promise of hope. There was the promise of Messiah. It is because of that what happens in Deuteronomy can happen. Deuteronomy builds on the deliverance and worship that they learn in Exodus. It builds on the holiness and atonement that God places on His people and commands for His people in the book of Leviticus. And it certainly has much to do with their wandering and their discipline. And now you're going into the land, and this is how you're going to live because of what God has been trying to instill in you for the last 40 years. And so not only is it good to remember what we've come through so far in this series, but it's important to know that this all ties in with the book of Deuteronomy as we're going to look at it today and in the future as well. I think I mentioned when we were doing Numbers last time that Deuteronomy will not be a single sermon approach. We're going to break up the book of Deuteronomy into at least 2 sermons, hopefully just the 2. But that is intentional and very much the plan. When we look at Deuteronomy, I want us to understand the theme of devotion throughout the book. Moses, and we'll see this in the first 4 verses, and it's repeated a couple times throughout, that they are staged in the plains of Moab, which is east of Jordan. Promised land is talked about as representing that section of land, if you will, between the Jordan and the sea. There are places east of Jordan, and he talks about that in Deuteronomy. There are places east of Jordan where I believe it's Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh take places east of Jordan. Not of terrible importance right now. But as they're staged there in the plains of Moab, they're looking at Jericho, they're looking at the promised land, and Moses is calling all of Israel together, which we'll talk about in a second, and he's saying, you're going to go there. You're coming to the place where God has promised to give you. This is how you're going to go. This is what you've been through, and this is where you're going. And he's instilling in their hearts and in their minds devotion to the Almighty God who has brought them out of Egypt with an outstretched hand. And so when we look at Deuteronomy, it is a plea for devotion in God's people. A couple of factotums, if you will, or little bits to know about Deuteronomy and kind of take away from it. It's quoted more than 80 times in the New Testament. Deuteronomy and Psalms are the two books of the Old Testament that are quoted most often in the New. As New Testament Christians, then, we do pretty well to have a grasp of what happens in Deuteronomy and what it is in the context around what Jesus himself, very often, the gospel writers, except for John. John is one of only six, the Gospel of John is one of only 6 books in the New Testament that does not quote Deuteronomy. I find that interesting. Everyone else quotes heavily from Deuteronomy, and so we need to understand the context around where those quotes are coming from so that as New Testament Christians, as New Testament believers, we do not lose sight of what's actually being said. One of the most famous phrases that comes explicitly from Deuteronomy is, "Hear, O Israel." We most associated with what's actually called the Shema, which is the Hebrew word for hear or listen. Shema Yisrael is the first 2 words in Hebrew of the Shema, which is it's become the prayer that they pray, or the thing that Jews even today will say daily, several times daily, and it comes from Deuteronomy chapter 6. We're beginning, I believe it's in verse 4. He says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord with all." And he goes on to give what Jesus refers to as the greatest command. That is Jesus quoting the Shema, which was very well known to the Jews, certainly in the first century, and definitely still today. However, the phrase occurs 5 times in Deuteronomy, and the actual phrase, "Hear, O Israel," there's versions of it, there's different ways that it's stated, but this specific phrase is only stated in Deuteronomy. Especially within the Pentateuch. There's some very similar, it comes really close, and especially the prophets, to saying, "Hear, O Israel," but the exact phrase, "Hear, O Israel," occurs only in Deuteronomy, and it does that 5 times, beginning in chapter 5, verse 1. We won't pick out all of those things, but it is good to know that this is a Deuteronomy-specific phrase, and that it's going to call our attention to something important in the text when we do come to it in our reading. I mentioned that the theme of Genesis is very present in the book of Deuteronomy, that theme of relationships and God's relationship with his people. That really comes to fulfillment in a great sense in Deuteronomy. In fact, the last use of the phrase, "Hear, O Israel," is in Deuteronomy, is there in chapter 27 and verse 9, where he says, "Hear, O Israel, today you have become the people of the Lord." So God puts his name, he claims them, they become the people of the Lord. Now they've always been, we're not going to unpack that right now, but that is a culmination, or culminating point here in Deuteronomy of much importance, and definitely historically to the people. But it shows, our third point on the screen here, the emphasis on relationship throughout the book of Deuteronomy. The phrase, "the Lord our God," is used, I believe it's 24 times. Let me make sure here. I think that's on the other slide. The Lord our God is used something like 24 times, it's 49 times in the book of Deuteronomy. It's only used once in chapter 3 and chapter 4. Otherwise, its heaviest concentration is in chapters 1 through 6. However, the phrase, the Lord your God, appears in Deuteronomy 249 times. And not only is that a high concentration for the book of Deuteronomy, but it is by far the highest concentration in all of the books of Moses. The language of the Lord your God it doesn't only occur in the book of Deuteronomy, but it occurs by far more often in this one book than the four that precede it. And so the emphasis of Moses is, this is who you are as a people. This is who God is to you as a people. This is the Lord your God. And he's drilling into them the relationship that God has given them with him as a defining factor. The phrase all Israel is also very unique in Deuteronomy. It does appear twice elsewhere in the books of Moses, but 14 times in Deuteronomy we see all Israel. It's 16 if you include phrases like all of Israel or something like that. But it does see a high concentration in Deuteronomy, all things considered. You could look at these as random facts. However, I think that each of them do point to something that we can understand thematically, or that we can understand to help us shape the big picture of both why Deuteronomy is important to us today and how we understand what's going on in the book as a whole. So, with that, let's go ahead and get into our outline. And our outline will start with one more big picture point, which is that the name Deuteronomy comes from the Greek. It's the Greek word, comes from the Septuagint, or the Greek translation of the Old Testament, specifically because in chapter 17, verse 18, there's a provision, in Deuteronomy 17, verse 18, there's a provision for if/when there's a king in Israel. One of the things that the king of Israel is commanded to do is to take a copy of the law, note that emphasis, we'll come back to it in a second, and the king is supposed to be intimately familiar with that law. That is how he is supposed to live in his own life, and certainly that is how he is supposed to lead the congregation of Israel. The phrase translated copy of the law in the Septuagint is Deuteronomia. That is where this title comes from, and it's kind of, some have accused it of being a mistranslation that might be using stronger language than necessary. But it gives us the impression, because what the word Deuteronomia literally means is second law. We often think of Deuteronomy as the second giving of the law, and in a way that's accurate. I don't think that's the most effective thing to take away from Deuteronomy. The Jews to this day call it the book of the words, or these are the words, which is Elech Debarim in the Hebrew, or something like that, don't quote me. Often called just Debarim, which is the words. Because the first line in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 1 is that these are the words that Moses spoke to all of Israel. And so there we see all Israel coming up its first time there in the first verse. But the thrust of the book, what's actually happening in the book, is Moses is speaking. In fact, if I had the opportunity to go back and to rename Deuteronomy, I would probably call it quadromoly. Sounds close enough. But quad meaning four, or quadra meaning four, and homily being a word that means sermon. In Deuteronomy, the way that I understand the breakdown, you can call it either 3 or, I think, 4 sermons that Moses gives the people as they're going to go in and possess the land. I won't make you start calling it quadromoly. In fact, I don't plan to use it the rest of the sermon. It's not a promise, though. But it's helpful for us to know that what's happening in Deuteronomy is, in fact, 4 sermons. The first sermon, and none of these are titled by Moses or any inspired person, but I would call the first one about devoted eyes. We'll talk about that in a second. That's chapters 1 through 4. Chapter 5 through 26 is by far the longest sermon in the book of Deuteronomy. A good defense of long sermons as, a thing that exists in theory, provably in practice at least once. But chapter 5 through 26 is the sermon that I would call devoted lives. That's where he gives the book of the law in Deuteronomy. Chapters 27 and 28 lay out what it looks like to be a devoted nation. and 29 and 30 is the blessings of that devoted nation. And chapter 31 and 34 are not a sermon, but there's a song, the blessings and the death of Moses. And so that is the overview breakdown, the 5 major divisions that I see in the book of Deuteronomy. You could combine chapters or sermons number 3 and 4. That's why some say there's 3 sermons in Deuteronomy. The blessings of a devoted nation still has a good thematic ring to it, and I won't feel violated or betrayed if you choose to write it down that way instead. That said, I plan mostly today to cover that first sermon. The first 4 books, the first 4 verses, it's very different, isn't it, in Deuteronomy, are the introduction, the setup there. It's telling you that this is what Moses is saying to all the people in the days when, and it explains that they had come from Horeb by way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea, and now they're in the plains of Moab, opposite Jordan, or east of Jordan, opposite the Promised Land. And Moses gets up and he starts speaking to the people, and he preaches this first sermon. And the contents of the sermon are there in verses 5 through chapter 4, verse 40. That's where the sermon ends. After that you have, and I'll just leave it as extra stuff for now, that kind of fills some informational gaps between chapter 4 and chapter 5. We can talk about that in a minute. I do want us to understand the contents of this first sermon. The purpose in the text of this sermon in verse 5 is stated as Moses undertook to explain this law, saying. And so he's going to give the law in chapter 5 through 26. The second sermon is actually the giving of the law in Deuteronomy. In chapters 1 through 4, this sermon, he's explaining why they have the law, why they owe allegiance to the law. One of the themes that we see in this sermon is the eyes. And that's why I've called it the sermon. Oh, you have a missed slide there. I changed what I thought it should be called halfway through building this. But this sermon should be still called Devoted Eyes, because the eyes are a heavy theme in this sermon. And it starts in chapter 1, verse 30. That the Lord your God who goes before you will himself fight for you just as he did for you in Egypt before your eyes. And in the wilderness, continuing in 31, where you have seen how the Lord God carried you as a man carries his son. And throughout this language of what you have seen God do, before your eyes, as a phrase occurs several times in this sermon, and he's laying out this case of their history. It's mostly, as the beginning of each of these sermons almost always contains, is a history of the people. In the case of this first sermon, verses 6 through 8 are the initial call. This is why I'm getting up in the first place, is because the time has come. The Lord has said we've been wandering long enough, and it's time to go in and take the promised land. That's emphasized in verses 6 through 8. In verses 9 through 18, he kind of defends himself as their leader. In chapter 1, verses 9 through 18, this breakdown isn't on the screen, but I can give you notes on this later. He kind of defends himself as their leader and points out, I've led you justly, and it hasn't been just me. The first historical fact that he reminds them of is that I knew that I was not going to bear you myself. I wasn't going to be the only person you all answered to. And so you chose from among yourselves leaders and judges from the older among you. And so and I charged these judges to hear the cases between you and to judge righteously, not to be partial in judgment. And that's what I commanded you at the time, all the things that you should do. So your leadership until this point, and so far as humans have been involved in your leadership, has been fair and just, or at least it's always been supposed to be fair and just. And then he comes to 19 through verse 46, where he explains why it's taken us so long to get here. One of the first things that's said, in fact, I think it's in verse 2, in chapter 1, verse 2. After telling us who is going to be speaking and where they are when he's speaking, the next thing that he says is how long it should have taken them to get there, which is 11 days. And it's taken them 38 years instead. And so he puts them in mind, or he reminds them of why that is. Because the first time that we set out, we sent spies in the land. They came back and they gave us a good report. They said, this is a good land. And you said, we're not going. We're afraid of the people in the land. And so because of your fear, because you rejected the Lord, because you rebelled against him, that's why he told us that, and especially in verses 34 and following, that not a one of these men of this evil generation shall see the good land that I swore to give to your fathers, except for Caleb, and throughout the text he adds Joshua as well. And then he ends the chapter 41 through 46 saying, even I am not allowed to go into the land. He'll talk about that more later, even just in this first sermon. If I needed a proof text to say that this is his point in this section of his sermon, it's that verse 46 says, so you remained at Kadesh many days, the days that you remained there. The point of what he said to this point is, this is why we just spent 38 years in Kadesh, in the middle of nowhere. It's because this is what happened, and that's why we stayed there. Now, while we were in the land, he gives a very brief summary of 4 things, really, that happened in those wilderness years. 2 nations that they were peaceful with, and 2 nations that they had victory over. 2 kings that they had victory over. They made peace or passed peacefully through Edom, because that is Edom, because that is the land and the people of Esau. And God said that he would spare them, they wouldn't be touched, they wouldn't have a problem. And Moab, because of his faithfulness to Lot. That Moab was also treated peacefully, and they did not have to wipe out the Moabites. Then, when he talks about King Sihon, starting in verse 26, the king of Heshbon, Sihon, king of Heshbon, and then in chapter 3, verse 1, Og, the king of Bashan, or Bashan, they were given victory over those kings, and that's how they secured that land east of the river. South with Edom and Moab, southeast, I should say, with Edom and Moab, and directly east, victories over Bashan and Heshbon. And so he reminds them of all of that. And again, our theme, which we pick up again in chapter 3, verse 21, I commanded Joshua at that time, your eyes have seen all that the Lord your God has done to these 2 kings. So will the Lord do to all the kingdoms into which you are crossing. You will not fear them, for it is the Lord your God who fights for you. So again, as he lays out what's happened, here's why it took us so long to get here. Here's why we spent 38 years in the wilderness. Here's why we're here now, because there's peace with Esau and Moab, because God said there would be. And there's victory over Og and King Sihon in Heshbon and Bashan, respectively, because God said there would be. Now keep going, because there will be victory, because God said there would be. And so all of their past is supposed to drive their future. That is the point of this focus on what they have seen and are seeing. What you have seen is God's faithfulness. What you have seen is God's strength. What you have seen is God's devotion to you. So go and obey and do all that the Lord commands you. In fact, when we pick up in chapter 4, that's exactly what he says. He says, now, O Israel, listen to the statutes and the rules that I am teaching you, and do them that you may live, and go in and take possession of the land. This is the first time that we really see it in Deuteronomy. It's going to come up repeatedly as he gives them the law, that the law is for their good. The law isn't because we serve a God of tedium. The law is not because we serve a God who loves placing heavy and unbearable burdens on his people. The law of Moses was not given because God is picky and really enjoys being picky. The law is given because God is holy and demands holiness in his people, but also because through these laws that command holiness, the benefit is their good. God blessed them for keeping it, and I suspect, I agree with those who suspect and who have extrapolated that the literal processes that God prescribes in the law of Moses have physical benefits, both in agriculture and in physical health and in other capacities as well. It was genuinely for their good. It is a benevolent God that gives the law of Moses, not a petty and trifling one. It is a benevolent God that gives them to this. And in fact, he even says in chapter 4, verses 6 and following, the reason that they've been given this command, part of the reason for the law, is so that the nations would look at Israel and say, see what wisdom. In the nation that keeps these laws, he says, look at what a wise people these are. He says in chapter 6, keep them and do them, for that will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples, who when they hear all these statutes will say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as the Lord, as our God is to us whenever we call upon him? What great nation is there that has statutes and rules so righteous as all this law that I set before you today? Immediately following that, he says again in verse 9, only take care, keep your soul diligent, lest you forget the things that your eyes have seen, lest they depart from your heart. He says, make them known to your children and your children's children, how on the day you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb. Again, he's talking about what your eyes have seen, and he's going to make that point in verse 15. So what have they seen? They've seen that he's talking about so far, the God that brought them from Sinai, the God that caused them to wander in the wilderness because of their rebellion, the God that has given them this good land and promised it to them, the God that made peace for them with Moab and with Esau, and the God that gave them victories over these two kings east of Jordan, and the God that, he's talking here about what they saw at Horeb. That you came near and stood, in verse 11, at the foot of the mountain, while the mountain burned with fire to the heart of heaven, wrapped in darkness, cloud, and gloom, and the Lord spoke to you from the midst of the fire. In his conclusion, he said, he's going to say, who else has this ever happened to? Who else of all the people in all of time got to witness what you've gotten to witness? Who else in all the world has God chosen the way that he's chosen you? Who else's eyes have seen what your eyes have seen? Now, he's making two calls to action. Arguably three. Two main calls to action. First of all, don't forget these things. Don't forget what God has done to you and for you. Don't forget the power of the God that brought you here and the power that was on display at Mount Sinai. Don't forget that. And because you remember that, here's the second. He says, because you saw, look at verse 15. Since you saw no form on the day the Lord spoke to you at Horeb out of the midst of the fire, beware lest you act corruptly by making a carved image for yourselves in the form of any figure. And he talks about idolatry. In verse 19, beware lest you raise your eyes to the heaven, and lest you, skipping a phrase here, be drawn away and bow down to them and serve them, things that the Lord your God has allotted to all the peoples under the whole heaven. When I brought you to Sinai, God is saying, when I brought you to Sinai and I showed you a trembling, flaming, smoking, glory-filled mountain, when I terrified you, you didn't see a form of anything. You didn't see a strong bull or a strong ox up there going back and forth with Moses. You didn't see a man that looked like this or like that. You didn't see a cherubim or a Nephilim. You didn't see anything. So don't make images of anything to worship. Because your eyes have seen no form. They saw great power but no form. Worship great power without worshiping a form. He makes this command about idolatry based on what they did not see on the mountain. You saw power, worship the powerful God. Worship the God who is, and this is quoted in the book of Hebrews, but in chapter 4, verse 24, the Lord your God is a consuming fire, a jealous God. Worship him. Finishing that main section, I think the main section is chapter 4, verses 1 through 31. Then there's the conclusion in 32. In that main section, he makes this point about idolatry given their past. real quick, two things that are in the text of this this sermon. First in chapter 3, verse 26, and here in chapter 4, verse 21, 3:26 and 4:21, both times, Moses talks about not being allowed to enter Canaan, and he says, because of you. It's because of you that I'm not allowed to enter the promised land. He says that in 3:26, and he says that in 4:21. Now, initially, that doesn't sound very true, does it? It sounds like Moses is maybe shifting some blame. Maybe he's sidestepping some responsibility of his own, because as we remember, in the book of Numbers, when he is forbidden to enter the promised land, that's because he disobeys God's instructions, right? He goes beyond God's instructions in giving water to the people. Now, it's because of the Israelites in two ways. And I was grateful to be put in mind of, it talks about it this way in the Psalm, in Psalm 106, isn't it? That it talks about this in the late 20s or early 30s of Psalm 106. It talks about this, but we can understand it being the Israelite, or because of the Israelites, in two senses. First of all, if they hadn't been bitter and whining and complaining, then Moses wouldn't have reacted the way that he did. It would have been a calm and normal process to come to a waterless place, to trust in God to provide for them water. And then all he has to do, because he doesn't have any pent-up emotions about the grievous people that he's in charge of leading, he doesn't have any emotional reason to perhaps overreact and do more than he should with the rock. The second reason that it's because of the Israelites, and what I think has more weight, is because Moses' disobedience had an audience. God needed to maintain for that audience, which is all Israel, that his holiness is unquestionable. His obedience to his law and to his commandments and statutes and instructions is unwavering. It is absolute and must be absolute. He does not tolerate disobedience. One could speculate that perhaps, if nobody's around, if it's in the middle of the night when everybody is sleeping and nobody's watching, and God says, I'm so glad they haven't complained, I do actually have a plan for how we're going to get water here. Go and tap this rock, and Moses taps and talks to it, or talks and taps to it, whatever you want to say he does extra in this theoretical situation, right? And nobody's around to see it, but he's gone beyond, just in the same way that he actually did in the congregation of Israel. We might speculate, and that's all it is, that he gets a slap on the wrist. God would say, that's not what I told you to do. There may be punishment, there may be consequences for that disobedience. It's probably not the biggest deal in the world. But because he does it brazenly in the sight of a people to whom God is impressing his character, his nature of holiness, he cannot tolerate that. And so it's because he had an audience. It's because Israel was there, and because Israel needed to learn not to mess with Almighty God. It's because of you that I'm not allowed to enter the promised land. Not because it's their action. It's not because it's their responsibility. But it's because they were there when it happened and needed to learn this lesson. In chapter 4, beginning in verse 32, as he makes the conclusion of this sermon, which ends, by the way, with that it may go well with you, reminding us, as he did at the beginning of the sermon, that this is all for your good, or at least at the beginning of chapter 4, verse 1, that you may live, verse 40, that it may go well with you and with your children after you, so on and so forth. In this time, or in this text, this last text, he says, ask now, we'll start in 32, ask now of the days that are past, which were before you, since the day that God created man on the earth, and ask from one end of heaven to the other whether such a great thing as this ever happened or was ever heard of. Did any people ever hear the voice of a God speaking out of the midst of a fire as you have heard and still live? Or has any God ever attempted to go and take a nation for himself from the midst of another nation by trials, by signs, by wonders, and by war, and by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and by great deeds of terror, all of which the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your eyes? God showed you this. God showed you that there would be that He is God, that there is no other besides Him. He let you hear His voice from heaven. I'm summarizing the rest here. He let you see His great fire and hear the words out of the midst of the fire because He loved your fathers and chose their offspring after Him. Brought you out of Egypt with His own presence by His great power. And He's brought you here as it is this day. He's given you this land of your inheritance as it is this day. So, because of what your eyes have seen, and because of what they've not seen, don't turn aside to anyone else. You know too much. You are without excuse if you try to worship the form of any other thing. But also, because you've seen this, look at what he says in verse 39. Know therefore today, and lay it to your heart. Lay it to your heart that the Lord is God in heaven above, and on earth beneath there is no other. That's why you should keep His commandments and His statutes. It's because you, as a devoted people with devoted hearts, which is going to be the thrust of future sermon, because of that, devote yourself to the living God. That's the thrust of his first sermon, but it's not what I want to end with this morning. And I do want us to actually end this morning. That's good news, right? I want to give you just the rough breakdown of the second sermon. We're not going to go anywhere as near as in-depth as we just went with the first sermon. I really like the theme of before your eyes in that sermon and the emphasis and the call to devotion because of their immediate history. In chapter 5 through 26, chapters 5 through 26, the second sermon about devoted lives, he starts with why they were given the law. In chapter 5, he starts with, again, Mount Sinai, the Ten Commandments that came from a trembling mountain to a trembling people. And in chapter 6, of course, we have what it looks like to be completely and totally devoted to God. You're going to love Him with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your strength, and with all of your mind. With all that you are, you're going to love God. And because you love God with all that you are, you're going to talk about it all the time with your family. You're going to put it everywhere around you. You're going to surround yourself with the love of God. You are going to be devoted people. You are going to live devoted lives. And that's how you must keep the laws, with devotion. In chapters 7 through 11, he talks about why. Some of my favorite passages in there are in chapters 9 and chapters 11, when in both cases he talks about why, or I'm sorry, it's in chapter 7 and verse 9, not 9 and 11. Chapter 7, picking up in verse 6 if you want to later, and chapter 9, starting in verse 4, and continuing if you want to look at that later. In both cases, he says, here's reasons that God did not choose you. It's not because you're the biggest nation. God didn't wake up one day and decide to be a Patriots fan because they keep winning. God didn't wake up one day and decide to pick Israel because, hey, there's a lot of them, so I'll be their God. He didn't do that. He made you great because He loves you and is keeping the oath He swore to your fathers in chapter 9. It's also not because you're so righteous. God did not choose a people who were righteous to be His. He chose a people that He loves, and He's keeping His promise to Abraham, their father, and He is making them righteous through His law. The point I want to end with is the point that he starts with. And I'll remind you of this next time we get to pick up Deuteronomy, and we'll hopefully make bigger strides and cover the rest of it next time. But in chapter 5, the beginning of his sermon is, Hear, O Israel, the statutes and the rules that I speak in your hearing today, you shall learn them and be careful to do them. That's the first Shema in Deuteronomy, the first Hear, O Israel in Deuteronomy. But look at chapter 5, verses 2 and 3. This is where we'll end. The Lord our God made a covenant with us in Horeb. Not with our fathers did the Lord make this covenant, but with us who are all of us here alive today. Wait a minute. In the last sermon, he spent no small amount of time reminding them that not everybody who was there at Sinai is here ready to go into Canaan today. And that's by design, isn't it? The reason they were at Kadesh for 38 years was so that nobody from Horeb, nobody who came out of Egypt would go into Canaan, except for Joshua and Caleb. Now, we probably remember that that wasn't an absolute statement. It wasn't nobody who was in Egypt or who was here at Mount Sinai will go into the Promised Land. But it's no one who is here after the spies come back with their report who is at that time over 20 years old and over, right? So there were people who were 19 years old when they were sentenced to wandering in the wilderness for 38 years, who are in fact in Egypt and will be in the Promised Land. There's the youth of the nation will in fact go in and take the Promised Land. So there's an element, there's a contingent there in the population that are at least 38 years old, right? 38 to 58, right, would be the math there. Maybe 57. That population was there at the mountain. And it was to them, not to their fathers, that God gave the law. But in a realer sense, it doesn't seem to really add up that he says, with us who are all of us here alive today, not with our fathers did the Lord make this covenant, but with us. I obviously transpose those two phrases. The point is not a comparison to their actual parents. The point, I believe, is a comparison to the patriarchs. It was with you, here and now, that this covenant exists. It is for you that this covenant exists. The law given at Sinai would govern them for the 38 years of wandering in the wilderness, but it was not for the 38 years in the wilderness that God gave them the law. He gave them the law. God knew then that they would spend 38 years, I'm convinced, but it wasn't for the 38 years in the wilderness. It was for their inheritance. It was for their nation in perpetuity that he gave them this law. It wasn't with Abraham that he gave them this law. It wasn't with Isaac or with Jacob that he gave them this law. It wasn't with Joseph and his sons that he gave them this law. It was with those that he brought out of Egypt. And that in chapter 27 he is going to say, now you have become the people of the Lord your God. It's with you. The reason I want to end with that is because as Christians today, the same is true. Not that the law of Moses is a covenant made with each of us standing here today, or sitting here today. But because the salvation offered, the gospel in which we live, is for you today. The covenant that God has made with you, that his son's blood is your soul's atonement. That you get to spend eternity in his presence if you are found faithful. That covenant is with you. Was it given to you? Were you there on the day of Pentecost? I have suspicions with some of you, but I won't name names. You weren't there on the day of Pentecost when the kingdom came and these promises were initially, this covenant was established. You weren't there. You weren't there, probably, when whichever of your ancestors first came to knowledge and understanding of the truth. It wasn't just for the apostles and the first thousands of disciples that God gave us the gospel. It wasn't for whichever of your parents or grandparents or great-great-great-great-grandparents that God gave us the gospel. It was for you. And it's for me here today. Because each of us have been delivered from sin. Each of us are called God's people. So the challenge, the question at the end of it is, can God accuse you with accuracy of devotion? Not can he accuse you of frequent attendance, even perfect attendance. Not can God accuse you of good Bible scholarship. Can God accuse you of genuine, heartfelt, day in, day out, breath in, breath out devotion to the Almighty God with an outstretched arm? Two outstretched arms. saved your soul? If the answer is not yes, and the answer is in any way that you need our help to live a devoted life or prayers for strength in living a devoted life, because it takes strength, we want to help you grow with God and go with God. So if we can, let us know by coming forward as together we stand and sing.